I am happy to introduce Michelle Anne Hobart. She is an associate therapist practitioner of energy medicine, writer, and holistic health educator. She holds a bachelor's degree in biology and a master's degree in philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness, and a master's degree in integral counseling psychology from California Institute of Integral Studies. She's going to talk to us today about spiritual emergence and spiritual emergency.
Beautiful. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I feel the spaciousness, and I'm feeling a little bit teary because there's a certain quality when you're sitting with others who really truly understand. You can feel it. And I feel that with you. So I just wanted to start with that and just say thank you for creating this space and this opportunity to share. Yeah. And like what I was just saying too was about feeling so deeply misunderstood in the experience by the system, and that a lot of the work in the last decade that I've done within CIS and outside of it has been around education for clinicians too, around what is spiritual emergence, what is spiritual emergency. And even though I guess for me it's a radical perspective of not necessarily saying that there's differential diagnosis to be done, but my perspective from my lived experience and my clients is that all mental illness is spiritual emergency. And so I'm on one side of the spectrum, I think, and so for if that's a placeholder like within the the spectrogram, whatever, like I'm over here. And that's because the two times that I was in the hospital for my spiritual emergency, like every being that I came into contact with that was there with SMI diagnosis, right? I was like, yes, I completely understand where you're coming from, and it's completely valid, and everything from like the voices and visions and things that they were experiencing were either infiltrations or they were, archetypal processes that they were in, to people that were really processing like collective trauma. So everything to me still hung within the framework of transpersonal psychology, right? There was still, I mean, and I know, Maladoma had that article that he wrote about like what's really happening in a mental institution. And in my opinion, I think that Sambampu is the true shaman of that farmer couple. But I had the same experience when I was there, and working with Will, working with Emma Bragdon, since then obviously working with Stan originally, like having had a sense of what spiritual emergence was before I went into my experience, I think was key. And of course, when I studied with Stan before, it was more along like holotropic breath work. It was more like transpersonal, like, what is the new psychology that we're, sort of bringing in. But I think that it was still enough there in like the future of psychology and everything. It was like, there was still a chapter in there that got inside me in a way that I could still say, maybe do my own differential diagnosis and be like, I'm not crazy. I'm not psychotic, right? I'm having an experience that was catalyzed, right? And I make this distinction with my clients. I said spontaneous or induced, non-ordinary states of experience, where it's like, or I guess it's extraordinary now, however they're languaging in extreme states. Because sometimes there are catalysts, right? Whether it's trauma, that's a catalyst, psychedelics, that a lot of the clients that I'm working with have been opened, into whether it's Kundalini or psychic opening or whatever category it is, from psychedelic experiences that were not held properly. Some is ignorance of the facilitator, and some is intentional harm. So naming that too, that's something that's happening that I'm in service to, supporting the survivors of. But trauma in the body, that I think of it like the three types of trauma, right? There's the initial trauma, whether we think about ACEs or we think about past lives or ancestral wounding, right? That there's trauma that's already laying underneath the surface that is what gets triggered, right? And then the trauma of the experience itself, like going into these states, whether it's ecstasis can even be traumatic, right? It's like eustress, right, is traumatic on the system, right? Because it's so beyond the normal bandwidth of what we can hold. And then of course, going into the dark night, as well. And then the trauma of the system on top of it. And so, and for me, there was this element of medical gaslighting too, where I felt that no matter how strongly I held to the truth of my experience, the more that proved to them that I was delusional. And all I can say is in the last 10 years, like the work that I've done, I did my 3,000 hours, I was like, I'm going to be in the system, the same system that did the thing to me, so I could do that transmutation process, right? Sort of like the Matrix or something. But just to say, like, not only to them, like I can legitimize myself according to these, statutes and these certifications and dot the I's and cross the T's and all that stuff to show you that I'm not what you say that I am. So there was a sense of like proving myself. Like I had to prove that I'm not crazy, on the one side of it, that was a motivator. Right. The other side of it was like, I want to hold it in another way so that other people don't go through what I went through. And both of those, I think, were equally motivating me in the work and still do to this day. But I think if we go to root cause, if we go to etiology, we have to look at systems of oppression. We have to look at power dynamics. We have to look at the scourge of false gurus, and the impact of non-consensual Shaktipat, Kundalini awakening, psychedelics, like all of these things that are meant to open people up. But that when people open, which is what they're supposed to do, the people that are supposed to be holding the space or facilitating that process do not have the skill to be able to do it, to be able to facilitate it. So what do? They say, oh, they're crazy, send them to the hospital. And that's not good enough. And it breaks my heart that there's not more spaces, more people who are trained in this, more people. I mean, at least with Emma's program, I know there's probably like 30 SECs that are actively certified right now, spiritual emergence coaches. And I know that the SEN has, an entire list of practitioners who are trained up in SE and can support people in that way. And many of them have full practices right now, right? Because there's the process of people popping and waking up right now. That's huge. So there just needs to be more. There needs to be more training. There needs to be more training, not only for clinicians, right? Not only for therapists and psychologists and psychiatrists, but for people who are working with non-ordinary states. That is a foundation. As much as we would say trauma, understanding trauma and the body is a necessity for these people to hold space properly, I would also say that spiritual emergence and emergency has to be a foundation for training in working with any either non-entheogenic or entheogenic non-ordinary states. Like I've had people who were in a 11-day Vipassana retreat go into spiritual emergency. People who were doing yoga training. So it's not all, psychedelic opening, but a lot of that is happening now too. So I'm definitely passionate about getting the information into the hands of the people that are the space holders and facilitators. So. I know how important this work is, and I'm grateful to just be sitting with you and knowing that you're doing this work too. So it's like those of us who are like kind of trying to get the word out, it's important.
Michelle, would you be willing to share with us a little bit about the programs that you have going right now?
Yes, sure. I would love to. Thank you. So Kyle Bowler and I, Kyle is also a trained SEC, and he's also getting his hours as a therapist. He's also the co-founder of Psychedelics Today, and he's working with the educational side of that organization. But he and I, before that, we developed an online course called Awakening Healers, which was kind of bringing together, a lot of the work that we did, with spiritual emergence. He studied with the transpersonal breath work, dream shadow breath work, and everybody trained with Stan. So it's all variations of holotropic breath work. And bringing that together, and then sensory motor, bringing that in, talking about trauma and the impact of trauma on spiritual emergence, or the relationship, like I said, of trauma. And that course I actually shared in a trauma class too, that I was, the teacher asked me to come in and present on that. And then I have a 12-week program, a coaching program that I take people through as well. It's sort of like the journey, and a lot of people lean into like the hero's journey right now, and that's fine. That's a great sort of archetypal scaffolding, but I like to think about it, instead of it being a patriarchal journey, I like to think about Inanna. So going into the underworld, and what do we shed, what do we release, and in order to be able to touch our deepest, darkest selves, and find that integration with the shadow sister self, sort of trying to bring some of the balance of the matriarchal back in, to the journey. But it's also very practical, right, in terms of how to tell the story of what happened to us. So that the narrative aspect of it, the reclaiming of our gifts and working with our energies. So bringing in a lot of the energy hygiene, and protocols and things like that I've had to develop out of necessity from being so porous in those extreme states, and the sort of impact of that. So it's definitely like a program that integrates both like very practical, grounded aspects of daily life, and self-care, and also team building. Getting different practitioners and different allies around you, and then also working with the energy body. And then I have an advanced energy program too, working, helping people like refine their capacity to work with their energy and stuff, and entities, and things like that. Yeah.
That's wonderful. And then you mentioned earlier that a lot of people are waking up.
Yes.
What are you noticing about how people are waking up right now during this whole ascension process that we're going through right now?
Yes, exactly. That's a wonderful question. I think it's both and, in that there are things that are catalysts that are accelerating the process, like we said, sort of this renaissance of psychedelics, and renaissance of interest in spiritual practices and modalities, right? So in a way, it's like, sort of the 60s coming back with like a sort of authoritarian fascist flair of ecocide, kind of overarching in a way that like has a heavier sort of impact. Sort of like when people are waking up and touching into these places, they're becoming terrified, right, with the truth of what's happening, in a way that is very different, I think, than the 60s, in that we were like, oh, love and light and unity and openness and all of that. But it's like, and of course the war, then, but now we have the war as well. So it's like, yeah, I think there's and what happens, I think, too, when people are isolated, like in the past 2.5 years or whatever, the pandemic, people get sort of siloed into algorithms and disinformation, and people in these vulnerable states of trauma and stress and overwhelm. And maybe they're taking psychedelics like in their house by themselves, or even whatever it is, right? People go into these states of awakening, and don't have the support, the adequate support, to be able to integrate what's happening, and are vulnerable to these individuals who are capitalizing upon people's openness and vulnerability. And so I think that there's been a real risk, that of people opening and not being held properly, and it being, more challenging, and more people not only waking up like in the ascension process, but also people waking up and disintegrating, and not knowing how to put themselves back together again. Yeah.
Wonderful, beautiful, beautiful. How can people get in touch with you if they want to work with you?
Thank you so much. Yeah. Uh, Michelle Anne Hobart.com is my website, and I also have a YouTube channel. That's my name, Michelle Anne with an E, Hobart, and I have some videos up there about spiritual emergence, about detoxification, different energy work, things like that. And I try to support other practitioners in different modalities that are in my team, my soul family as well. So I have some videos on there so that everyone can be connected in terms of getting what they need as far as resourcing. That's really, really important to me to help connect people with what they need and realize that they're not alone, whether that means peer support, if that means therapy, if that means getting support for guide abuse recovery or cult abuse recovery, or actually getting into, like we said, sort of a program maybe that's more grounded in getting their needs met on a day-to-day basis, getting really solidified and grounded in their lives again, and then maybe developing and furthering their own gifts in different ways, because for me, I think the spiritual emergence process is also a process of awakening into our path as healers, our path as spiritual teachers, and in other traditional cultures, people would see that and they would be like, oh, now you need a mentor. Now you need support to really fulfill your gifts. And so people are opening into gifts and not being able to work with them. And so that's really important to me too, that people feel seen and that intuition, in that capacity. And then it's a matter of bringing agency and refinement to those gifts to be able to work with them in the world, offer them to others. Yeah.
Yes. And I'm wondering, what advice would you give clinicians working in the typical Western biomedical world who are working with the spiritual emergent?
Hmm. This is an interesting place because I will be honest with you, until a few months ago, I wasn't sure whether or not I was actually going to take the exam. And the reason is I was like, okay, am I more effective being outside of the system or am I more effective being in the system and working that line, Um, I think if people are showing certain what they would call symptoms, right? Um, Specifically, if it does go into realms that have to do with energy and spirituality, I think that's when they need to recognize their scope of competence and scope of practice and realize that they are no longer able to serve that person. And they need to refer them to a specialist that specializes in spiritual emergence or in psychic opening, in my case, or whatever the category is, instead of assuming, which happens most of the time, assuming that they're psychotic. And even in the most advanced cases where people they call it word salad, right? If you listen with the right ears, you actually can hear what they're saying. They're speaking metaphorically, they're speaking symbolically, they're speaking archetypally, right? And so it's like it's like there's different filters on, right? They have a filter that says, look for the problem. and look for the problem that can be solved by X medication or whatever it is. And so it's a matter of, on the one hand, removing certain filters that are the assumptions that say that there's either psychosis or normalcy, whatever that means, right? That at least put it on a continuum, right? Where it's like we can slide around, and especially women, it's like we have like cycles even throughout the month where it's an expansion and contraction of these states of experience and sensitivity. But so removing some filters of assumptions, and then also getting training. So it's like you can recognize when you're working with a person that's in an extreme state that would be considered spiritual emergency, and to know that in that case you need to pull in people that are trained in energy work, that are trained in spiritual healing, that are trained in spiritual emergence holding and grounding, right? So and at least like transpersonal psychology, right? That validates the ontological reality of these other realms. That's a primary thing, and it's not a given. I have met Western clinicians that are open to it, thank God, right? But how hard it is when we're in those states and not held in that way, and our reality is devalidated. It's very, very traumatizing. So that's what I would share with them is realize the impact when you deny somebody's reality, especially when they're in such a vulnerable and open state. It's like if the Hippocratic Oath is a thing that you're doing, if that's the foundation of your work, then you have to understand the ethical implications of what you're doing to someone else, to their soul, to their psyche, when you say that they're delusional and they're psychotic and that their experience is not real.
So we're going to start to wrap this up. Is there any last minute advice or suggestions for those watching this, for those who are experiencing spiritual emergency, or those who are working with the spiritual emergence?
So what I'm feeling into is the connection between the body and the earth. And that if we look at the holons of the wounding that's happening at every level, we can see these patterns. And we can see the places where the systems that are in place perpetuate harm. And we can start to be a part of the solution. And working in this way is part of that solution, and working with honoring, that radical honoring of someone's truth, of their embodiment, and of their connection to the larger process of evolution on the planet.
Absolutely. Michelle, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. And I feel so gifted to spend time with you.
Thank you so much. It's been such a joy, and just to even have the freedom to just allow whatever comes forward and comes through to be shared. It felt so beautiful to have that space. So thank you for holding in such a beautiful way.
Thank you.